Okay, so we're going to go over chapters 17 to 22. This involves the trial. So there's a lot of information that goes on here. This is kind of the main climax of the novel. So we're going to do our best to get through everything. So the trial in itself is, in essence, Mayella Ewell accusing Tom Robinson of rape. And Mela Ewell is supported by her father, Bob Ewell. And we talked a little bit about the Ewell family before. We know that they are one of the lowest classes in terms of that social ring. So Atticus Finch being at the top. We talked about the Cunninghams, Bob Ewell. Now, Bob would be above Mayella because he is a man and she is a woman. The only person that Mayella would have power over is someone who is African American. And in this case, that is Tom. And that brings up the essential problem is that Tom has not raped Mayella. Atticus himself defends the idea that the rape statute is a good thing to have and that women do need to have that brought to court. But the problem is that Mela is lying, that Tom did not rape her. So we see two main characters kind of introduced in this section. Chapter 18 focuses on Mayella and chapter 19 focuses on Tom. So we know that Mayella is the oldest child. She has no friends. She doesn't even understand the word. When Atticus asks her, do you have any friends? She thinks he's making fun of her. She's used to strenuous labor. She's the only one in her home who seems to have work and chores to do. They're very impoverished. She's lonely and isolated. Her mother has disappeared. Her father is abusive. Scout talks about how they eat food from the dump, how there's no running water. When Mayella herself describes the family, she talks about how there's lots of diseases or illnesses often in the family and how they live behind the dump. It comes out rather subtly that she herself is being sexually abused by her father, and she doesn't know what respect is because it's something that has never happened to her. And this is kind of where Mayella is portrayed as a victim, and you should feel sympathy for her, but she is innocent in a sense that she is ignorant and unable to do anything other than what her father says, but she's also guilty because she does condemn Tom. And at this time, there were lots of anti-miscegenation laws. So Black men and women who were white could not mix or vice versa. These were part of those Jim Crow laws that we looked at in The Help. And it means basically that they could never be together. So that is why it's considered a crime for Tom to have potentially allegedly raped Mela. But of course, we know that he did not. We do have some interesting quotes, though, about Mayella that shows that she's a little bit different than the rest of her family. Against the fence, in a line, were 6 chipped enamel slop jars holding brilliant red geraniums cared for as tenderly as if they belonged to Miss Maudie. People said they were Mayella Ewells. And this shows that Mayella is different. The fact is, Mayella herself is that red geranium, and yet she's living in a slop jar. And that is a symbol as well, right? So the red geraniums, they kind of represent that hope or growth. But of course, the fact that they're in that slop jar, something which is referring to like human waste and that rotten aspect, there's no escape for her, right? So these red geraniums themselves represent Mayella, but of course, there is no escape for her. And her character arc is quite tragic because of that. Later, a couple of people remark on them, mainly Scout. Mayella looked as if she tried to keep clean, and I was reminded of the row of red geraniums. And this is that emphasis that Mayella wants to escape the life that she has, but she's unable to do so. Tom Robinson is described as having a loving family, wife and children. He's honest. He only has one good arm, which is important because that's kind of part of why it would be impossible for him to rape her. He would have been unable to beat her on that side of the face since he did not have the use of that arm. Whereas her father is left-handed, and he signs his name with his left hand. Now, it's also kind of seen as sinful, which is why he makes the comment that he's a God-fearing man, because he's very ignorant. But what that shows is that he was the one who beat his daughter. Now, he's very sympathetic towards Mela. Tom Robinson feels for her. He tries to be kind to her because he pities her. He pities her situation. He knows that she has no love or friendship or any sort of compassion in her life. But he is really scared, and he runs away from the scene because of his fear over those racial laws. And he talks a little bit about her. He says, Mela tells him, she says what her papa do to her don't count. And that's where we see that she has been sexually abused by her father. It's kind of implicitly implied there. He talks about how she watered them red flowers every day, how he was happy to help her with the chores. I was glad to do it. Mr. Evil didn't seem to help her none, and neither did the children. And then how it was actually Mela who was the one who initiated contact. She grabbed me around the leg. She hugged me. She said she never kissed a grown man before, and she might as well kiss an N-word. And that it brings us back to that idea of power and social class, because the only person that Mela would have power over is Tom Robinson due to her race. And that is why she kind of takes advantage of him, especially in the fact that he is a kind man, and he does sympathize with her and helps her out with those chores. So in terms of our characters, we see a lot of progression. We see more progression from Jem because he's older and he also understands more of what's going on. But we do see some progression with Scout too. She does learn from others. She had her own preconceptions about Dolphus Raymond. She talks about how he's a drunkard and how he's always drinking alcohol in his brown paper bag. But she realizes they were false. And we see a lot about Dolphus Raymond in chapter 20. And that kind of connects to the class system again. Dolphus Raymond is upper class. He's very wealthy, and he pretends to be drunk in order to live with his black wife and his mixed children. That would not be accepted by society. So he pretends to be drunk to give people an excuse to allow him to continue to live his life. Mela, on the other hand, she is ignored by other white people because of her low class. She's ignored by African Americans due to the racial system that's in place. She has no wealth or privilege as a woman, and she's unable to do anything like Dolphus Raymond is able to. So even Scout realizes that Dolphus Raymond actually is a good person, and her preconceptions were false. Scout also realizes that Tom is innocent, and that Mela is a victim yet chooses to hurt Tom in order to avoid punishment for herself. She also learns how the African American community respects her father for taking a stand and defending Tom. We see that when they stand for him as he walks out of the courtroom. There's that connection where she talks about how it's like her father's taking on the town, but there's no bullet inside the gun. Right, he's unable to defeat the racism, and they ultimately convict Tom of being guilty. We also see that after the trial, that the African community family members and community members bring him food because that is the only thing they can bring him, even though there's a Great Depression going on. So again, they value how he has attempted to do his best. And this is quite remarkable because you have to realize that it would be quite different to have someone representing the African American community. So individuals like Hecate, the sheriff, Judge Taylor, they have picked Atticus on purpose. There are other people in the town who support what is right and go against the racial systems. But definitely Atticus is in the eye of the public as the one mainly defending him. Even Miss Maudie stayed out of the trial out of respect, right? She waits on the porch. So there are other people who are not racist in the town, but it is definitely challenging for Atticus to fight against those who still are. And we see Jem being really affected by these conflicts. He talks about how Mr. Gilmer is treating Tom and using racial epithets like, are you being impudent to me, boy? Okay, think about that. Would any of you call your father boy? Like, come here, boy, to your father? No. The answer is no, you probably wouldn't, right? And yet it's okay to call Tom that because they're referring to him in terms of a racial slur, and that's why they're using it. So it is not okay to do this, but that is why these characters are, because they are prejudiced and biased against African Americans. And Jem says, I don't care, it ain't right to do him that way. It just makes me sick. And the fact that he feels sick by this shows how he's impacted by witnessing racism in his society. Jem starts to see the truth about his town. When he talks to Dolphus Raymond, Dolphus says, you haven't even seen this town, but all you got to do is step back inside that courthouse. And he realizes that Jem is growing up and learning this for the first time. And Jem later reflects on that when he talks to Miss Maudie, and he says, I always thought Maycomb folks were the best folks in the world. Miss Maudie responds, no, we're the safest folks, and the idea that they are unwilling to accept change. And Jem has his whole world shattered. So there's definitely a theme here of growing up for Jem. This is represented later too, and Miss Maudie gives Jem a big cake instead of a small one. And even represented at the end of the trial. His hands were white from gripping the balcony, and his shoulders jerked as if each guilty was a separate stab between them. This is really upsetting to Jem because he believes in justice, and he believes in the court system, and he believes that if an innocent man is innocent, that he should go free. What he doesn't understand is how racism is involved in that trial system and that court system, and how that is coloring, mind the pun, that people's judgment. So we already talked about red geraniums. In terms of Mela, we have the idea of that mockingbird here, and subtly again, it was also brought up in chapter 15 with the mob when Mr. Underwood says something about the idea, and you'll see this later too when he writes about it in his newspaper. Later on, that it's a sin to harm someone who does no harm to others. And in this case, Tom Robinson, right, with one arm, incapable of defending himself, is very similar to that idea. He's an innocent man who is being harmed for this. Jem compares himself to a caterpillar as well. He talks about it as if he's been sleeping. That represents his innocence, and has only now awakened and realized who the people are in his town. This is his reality, and that reflects that idea of growing up. And then we see that cake again. Typically, there were 3 small cakes, one for Scout, Dill, and Jem, but Miss Maudie this time gives Jem a slice of the big cake to represent that he is growing up. So we talked a little bit about the class system. That goes with the little drawing of the ladder that I've shown you before. We see racism again in the trial. You felt sorry for her, Mr. Gilmer says, but the damage was done below us. Nobody liked Tom Robinson's answers, because the fact that Tom Robinson, who is here in terms of that social class and racial class, would feel poorly and feel badly for Mela goes against their preconceptions that white individuals are better than other races. And that is why they don't like his answer. That's why, for the fact of him saying he feels sorry for her is considered a affront to the white community, and how they're very upset. We also see racism when the children are discussing how people are treated with Dolphus Raymond, and Scout says, Atticus says treating a colored man is 10 times worse than treating a white man. And that is because that they cannot fight back, that they have been put in place with the racial laws, Jim Crow laws, that keep them in one place, and they're unable to seek restitution or equality in the law. And that injustice is continuing throughout. So we can see a couple of things for injustice, like definitely in terms of Tom. That is a whole another section for sure. My pen's dying. But we also see it with Mela herself. Tom says that when Bob Ewell sees his daughter kissing Tom, he says, you goddamn whore, I'll kill you. And it's Bob Ewell who beats his daughter for going against the racial conventions of society. Mela blames Tom, as her father wants her to do that. The problem with this is her word will kill Tom, and that is the main issue. So he is condemned, he goes to jail, but the idea is he will be killed later on for that crime. Atticus, though, is hopeful of a retrial in this moment. And he does try and explain to Mela that her word can kill Tom. And he says, why don't you tell the truth, child? Didn't Bob Ewell beat you up? And that's the truth, and yet she hides from that. So loss of innocence. We definitely see that with Jem. It was Jem's turn to cry. He realizes that what is right and what is just is ignored due to race. We also see the idea of how Atticus says he cannot pity Mela Ewell. She's committed no crime. She's merely broken a rigid and time-honored code of our society. She is a victim of cruel poverty and ignorance, but I cannot pity her. She is white. And her crime is that she tempted a Negro. But she pushes that away from herself in order to absolve herself of her sin in terms of breaking that rigid and time-honored code. And because of that, she condemns Tom Robinson. I made a little section as well here, just in terms of integrity, because this is really important in terms of what is happening with Atticus. Miss Maudie explains, I simply want to tell you that there are some men in this world who were born to do our unpleasant jobs for us. Your father's one of them. So Atticus is taking on that role of that defender and what is right and just. So he is definitely a righteous individual. And she explains, we're so rarely called upon to be Christians, but when we are, we've got men like Atticus to go for us. And in that, Miss Maudie is saying that the town is unable to be a true Christian group of people, even though that's what they claim to be, and they go to church on Sunday. They're unable of loving their neighbor and not being racist. And that is why they condemn Tom for a crime he didn't commit. So there's a couple of other things then I said for quotes of importance. As Tom Robinson gave his testimony, it came to me that Mela Ewell must have been the loneliest person in the world. She was even lonelier than Boo Radley. When Atticus asked had she any friends, she seemed not to know what he meant. And that really highlights that we should feel badly for Mela. And she attempts to go against her society, attempts to fulfill her own wishes by doing some things she wants. And yet, once it comes back on her, she pushes Tom Robinson to the forefront and blames him. Tom Robinson was probably the only person who was ever decent to her, but she said he took advantage of her, and when she looked at him, it was as if he were dirt beneath her feet. So she attempts to go against the conventions of society, and yet when push comes to shove, she throws him under the bus. She's the one who condemns him, and that's why Atticus says it is unfair that even though he feels badly for Mela, she is guilty of potentially killing Tom Robinson. There's also this really interesting part in the book where in the trial he brings up a lot of good points. It says that Thomas Jefferson once said that all men were created equal, a phrase the Yankees and distaff of the executive branch of Washington are fond at hurtling as. There's a tendency in this year for certain people to use this phrase out of context, right? It's the most ridiculous thing to promote the stupid and idle along with the industrious, because all men are created equal. Educators will gravely tell you the children left behind suffer terrible feelings of inferiority. But he says that's not true. People say that we are all equal, but he says it's not. We know all men are not created equal. Some people are smarter than others. Some people have more opportunity because they're born with it. Some men make more money than others. Some ladies make better cakes than others. Some people are born gifted, right? And he says, it's not true that people are equal. We're not created equal. However, there's one place that you are equal, and he says that institution, gentlemen, is the court. In this country, our courts are the great levelers, and in our courts, all men are created equally. And that's where he tries to restore reason to the town by explaining to them that this is the one place where they should be equal. They should be treated according to what they have done or have not done. And he says, in the name of God, do your duty. But of course, they do not. They do convict him. And we have that moment where then he walks out and the African American community and Scout, stand, for the father. I looked around. They were standing. All of us on the balcony of the opposite walls. The Negroes were getting to their feet. Reverend Sykes' voice was as distant as Judge Taylor's. Miss G and Louise, stand up. Your father's passing. And they do that out of respect because they themselves had expected that Tom Robinson would be convicted because of his race. And yet they respect how Atticus has tried so hard to restore justice in the system. And that is the essential elements for chapters 17 to 22, which is the trial.